Mainstream media, the Department of Energy, and a few other institutions are now coming out and changing their story, changing their narrative about the origins of the pandemic over the course of what's happened in the past 2 to 3 years. So we are seeing that the narrative is being flipped. The story, which had existed for the past 2 to 3 years of this is where the origins came from, here's what we know, it's definitive, this is the highest likely possible cause of this current effect, we are seeing that the media is changing completely. Now, they're slowly rolling this out. It's still very hush-hush, but the question here is why all of a sudden are they changing their narrative? Because the information, we haven't received any new information. All the information is relatively the same. Of course, there's new data that comes out, and with this new data, we reevaluate the situation using the scientific method, and we come to a better conclusion. But there are other perspectives that we can explore, and those other perspectives are, okay, now we have a full-on proxy war going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and there are different interests that are aligning themselves with that proxy war. Now, everyone at the bottom, everyone in the middle, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in the West, you're losing. Your taxpayer money is going towards fueling this war. Inflation is skyrocketing. We're seeing the average consumer, the average individual, really be crushed by more and more drama, more and more chaos that's unfolding in the world. And when we look at how interests come together and they try to implement public policy or they try to commit to some kind of action that would serve their own purpose, we see that they need public sentiment, especially in democratic nations or more developed nations. So if we look at the West, we have a bunch of developed nations. To gain power from the people, you have to get their support. You have to culturally indoctrinate them to your narrative, to your ideology. And thus you have to create public sentiment. Now, if you paint Russia as a boogeyman, that's great. But you have to constantly change the news cycle. So you have to introduce a new boogeyman and make the catastrophe or the potential of a catastrophe much greater than before. So now China is becoming the next boogeyman because they are being blamed for what had happened in the past 2 to 3 years. So now if we have China teaming up with Russia, and then we have the Western Front, well, now this is the potential for a World War III, which is something that no one really wants. Of course, you will have the military-industrial complex. You'll have certain politicians, certain elitist groups, certain corporations that take advantage over reconstructing an area that was war-torn. These different interests who align themselves at the top, these are the institutions that benefit off of this chaos. So now, if they're able to culturally manipulate the people into thinking, hey, this is where our funds, where our efforts, where our time and energy should be, because we're facing let's say, an apocalyptic situation, then the people will come together, the majority of the people. They'll be fear-mongered because that's an emotional reaction. Well, let me start with this. It's an emotional reaction from the people whenever they hear certain news that may trigger a survival response. So if you have a potential World War III, and it's everywhere on the news, your peers are talking about it, you have an emotional reaction because you genuinely want to survive. Your biological purpose on this earth is to survive and then also to reproduce. So if you now come to the awareness that my existence is fleeting, my existence is at risk, you will sacrifice whatever liberties you have as an individual, which is your power as an individual, and you will give it to the state as a form of security. This is an implicit contract, okay? It's not an explicit, overt contract, it's covert. And with this new contract, now the public sentiment supports the agenda of the state. The state can then use that motive to fund their war efforts. Now, are there people who are suffering on both sides? Are there people who are suffering in Ukraine? Yes, of course, there are people who are suffering in Ukraine. There are innocent lives in the midst of Ukraine, of the proxy war, and their lives are being ruined to a massive degree. And so we do want to protect innocence, but we have to understand there are people and institutions, corporations, who don't really care about collateral, whether it's your individual rights, whether it's casualties. They're more concerned with the financial motive and then the ideological motive. There are different ideological motives. It could be something as simple as we want to have multinational corporations spread across the world, and therefore, instead of conquering land, like how we would traditionally do in history, we are now conquering people, culture, and nations by implementing our corporations that we're colluding with And those corporations are going to become oligopolies within those nations that we're covertly conquering and also overtly. So we have to understand the entire plan of action and notice that our cognitive function must override our emotional reaction. Because if we let these people who understand, they're very intelligent people. However, a lot of them are malicious. They don't think they're malicious. They believe they have good intentions, but their intentions are based off of their improper ideology. And so they use the justification of to enact my good intentions, to enact my proper ideology, which is it's a fallible statement. I must do X, Y, and Z, and there will be collateral, but it's for the greater good. And the greater good, again, is based off their ideology. It's all subjective. Now, you can have two different concepts. Both would be subjective to each other, but one concept could be better than the other if there are certain priorities in place, like individual rights. So if you value individual rights, that priority would be prioritized higher than the other contrasting ideology, even though they're both subjective. So we need to understand that there are certain... This type of motive has been going on since the beginning of civilization. Humans are strategic, deceptive, cunning, clever. They work well together, the teamwork, assuming certain interests align. And so once we understand that they know how to tap into people's psychology to rile up people's emotions, and they know that's what's going to get a better reaction than appealing to them logically, which would be, that would now bring out your cognitive side of your brain instead of the more primitive side, which is an emotional reaction, they can effectively influence you towards their agenda. Once we wake up to that, we can now hold them accountable. We can hold these outside forces, these external, stronger forces accountable and prevent catastrophe, which really doesn't help the majority of people. The majority of people want to be left alone. They want to go to their job. They want to hang out with their family. They want to have low taxes. They want to have reasonable inflation, 1% to 2% a year, not 10+% a year. They want to be able to enjoy life. But when you have intelligent, malicious people who think they're do-gooders, they are able to manipulate the majority of the population, and it always results on, not always, but it's dependent on the minority of the population to rise up and counter these individuals. So it's effectively one minority of the population against the other minority of the population, and the people in between are the ones who get caught in the catastrophe.